Chapter 4 Unheralded Allies. Athel Turallion was but the first in a long line of great victories for Malekith and the Nagarothi. They subdued the greenskins of the forests around the city and forged eastwards across the new continent. After almost half a century, Athel Turallion having grown into a teeming port along with other settlements such as Tor Alessi and Tor Cathir, Malekith looked to found another city further to the east. Over the years, more Nagarothi had made the journey to the colonies, and Malekith's host now numbered over 20,000 warriors. With this army, he marched along the great river Anarene, which flowed all the way from the mountains to the sea for hundreds of leagues. He put goblin camps to the torch and forced back the beastmen and other vile creatures of the deepest woods. In the wake of his advance, the Nagarothi cleared the forests and built fortified farms. To the south, other cities were also prospering greatly, and their rulers were eager to seek alliance with the Prince of Nagareth. The forces of other elven lords joined the move eastwards. There were others too, who were soon to learn about this brilliant general and charismatic leader, the dwarves. It was in the third year of Malekith's great eastward push that he first came across the folk of the mountains. The forests of Elfin Arvan began to thin as the foothills of the mountains rose up amongst their boughs, and scouts from the Nagarothi host returned to Malekith to report that they had found something unusual in the woods. Large areas of trees had been cut down, not by the crude hacking of beastmen or orcs, but smoothly sawn and felled. They noted that the tracks of booted feet were plentiful, and evidence of large, well-built campfires had been found in the clearings. Malekith assembled a company of his finest warriors, and for several days they marched further eastwards, following the trail as it led towards the mountains. The elves found the remains of encampments and marvelled at the precision with which tents had been aligned, fire pits dug, and the trees hewn to form clearings of almost uniform squares. The ground was trampled by many feet, and there were also evidence that temporary palisades and ditches had also been dug and then removed or filled in. That the strangers were organised was in no doubt, and Malekith ordered his scouts to remain vigilant day and night. It was another 3 days before the elves came upon a path, or rather a road. It began at the largest campsite that they had encountered, and from the tracks that led to the north, west and south, this had been used as some sort of staging area for forays in all directions. The earth was not merely trodden down, but deliberately packed and seeded with stones to make the footings more secure. The road itself was of similar build, stretching away to the southeast, cutting through trees and hills without deviation for as far as the eye could see. Malekith ordered his warriors to stay off the road, but they followed its course from a little way into the forest, their stealthy advance concealed by the trees. As night fell, the elves saw the glow of bonfires in the distance, several miles away, and plumes of smoke rising across the stars. Malekith was torn as to what course of action to take. If these unknown woodcutters were hostile, then it would be far better to surround their camp at night. On the other hand, coming upon the strangers in the hours of darkness could possibly lead to surprise and cause the force they were trailing to respond with justified hostility. In the end, Malekith decided to compromise. He left a few of his swiftest runners near to the road and ordered them to return with all speed to warn the colonies if he did not return or otherwise send word by daybreak. His most cunning archers Malekith dispatched to circumnavigate the camp and wait in ambush should their unknown quarry attempt to fight. They climbed into the branches of the trees and moved above ground from bough to bough, so silent and unnoticed that not even the birds were disturbed at their passing. The others he brought alongside the road and told them to wait a short distance from the camp, ready to provide reinforcements if things went ill. With two of his lieutenants, Yesir and Elandrian, Malekith approached along the road, weapons sheathed, their cloaks thrown back across their shoulders so that they concealed nothing that might cause suspicion. As they neared the camp, the elves saw two large braziers burning on either side of the road, casting a wide illumination. In the light stood a handful of diminutive beings, the head of the tallest no higher than an elf's chest in build. They were stocky, their shoulders and chest broad with muscle, their guts solid and of considerable girth. They were extremely hairy. Each sported a beard that reached down to their waist, and two of them had facial hair hanging almost to the tips of their weighted boots. Each of them wore a heavy coat of chainmail, tied with a thick leather belt with a broad iron buckle. Their arms were bare but for golden torques, twisted into intriguing designs, and the nose guards of their helms covered much of their wide faces. Atop the helms were small crests of leaping boars or stylized dragons, and three had horns protruding. It was only after careful consideration that Malekith assured himself that these horns were indeed attached to the strangers' headgear and not sprouting from their skulls and passing through holes in their helms. Each held a single-bladed axe, of design unlike anything Malekith had seen before. They each also had a large round shield, rimmed with riveted iron and emblazoned with extraordinary designs of coiling worms, anvils, and winged hammers. They were gathered in a group about one of the braziers, talking amongst themselves. The prince's keen hearing caught snatches of a guttural tongue, much like gravel rolling down a slope, or the crunch of shingle underfoot. It grated on Malekith's nerves, and he just managed to stop his hand straying to the hilt of his sword. The sentry saw the three elves approaching, and turned as one to stare at them. Malekith and his two companions stopped where they were, just inside the circle of firelight, some 50 or 60 paces from the guards. The strange warriors exchanged hurried glances, and then nods from four of them sent the fifth running back into the camp, moving surprisingly swiftly on his short legs. The two bands stood and simply eyed each other. They remained in this stalemate for some considerable time. Eventually, a party of the dwarfs came marching up the road from the camp, over a dozen of them. One was obviously their leader, his beard braided into 4 long plaits, bound with many golden clasps. Underneath this expanse of bristle, Malekith could see a blue jerkin embroidered with gold thread in angular knotwork designs. The others walked deferentially a few paces behind him, their eyes wary, their grips tight on axes and hammers. Malekith held his hands far out to his sides to show no hostile intent, though he knew full well that he could still be capable of drawing his blade in the blink of an eye. Yesir and Elandrian did likewise. A surreptitious glance to the left and right revealed several of the elven scouts hidden amongst the leaves, arrows bent to bows trained on the camp leader as he stomped forward. He stopped between the braziers and gestured for the three elves to approach, and then stood with his arms folded solidly across his chest. As they walked slowly up the road, Malekith waved his lieutenants to stop about 10 paces short of the dwarves, and took a few more steps. The leader looked at the prince with a frown, though Malekith could not tell if this was an expression of displeasure or the dwarf's natural demeanour. All of them appeared to be scowling. This close, Malekith could smell the dwarfs as well as see them. He quelled a sneer as an offensive mixture of cave dirt and sweat assaulted his nostrils. The dwarf leader continued to look Malekith up and down, and then, turning his head, barked something to his underlings. They relaxed slightly, lowering their weapons a fraction. The leader proffered a grimy hand and spat something like, "Kurgrik." Malekith looked down at the grubby paw extended towards him and fought to keep the disdain from his expression. "Malekith," the prince said, giving the dirty hand a quick shake, before swiftly withdrawing his grip. "Malkit," the dwarf said, finally breaking into a thin smile. "Close enough," Malekith replied, fixing his face with a pleasant smile, learned from many years spent hiding his frustrations in the courts of Ulthuan. "Elf," Kurgrik said, pointing at Malekith, and the prince could not keep the surprise from his face. The dwarf broke into a wide grin and let out a gruff laugh, and then nodded. "Elf," he said again. With a wave, the dwarf leader invited the three into his camp, and as Malekith stepped forwards, the Nagarothi prince gave the most imperceptible nod to the warriors in the trees. Without disturbing a single leaf, they withdrew from sight. The layout of the camp was as Malekith had surmised, from the evidence they had found in the forest. 5 rows, each of 5 tents, were spread out across a square glade cut into the woods on one side of the road. At the end of each row burned a small and neat fire in deep pits lined with stones. The dwarves have all gathered to look at the newcomers, and shamelessly gawped at the tall, slender elves as they walked into the camp, keeping their pace steady so as not to move quicker than their hosts. Dark, inquisitive eyes glared at them from every angle, but Malekith could feel that the looks were of curiosity and not enmity. For their part, the elves regarded the dwarves with neutral expressions, nodding politely as they caught the eye of one camp member or another. The dwarves led them to the far side of the camp, where a large fire was burning, surrounded by low wooden benches. Here the elders sat themselves down, flanking their leader, who gesticulated for Malekith and his comrades to do likewise. Malekith tried to sit down with as much dignity as possible, but on the low dwarven seat his knees were well above his waist, and so he reclined to one side to assume a more comfortable position. For some reason, this raised a chortle amongst some of the dwarves, but it seemed good-natured enough. Tin tankards were thrust into the elves' hands, and 3 dwarves came forwards, 2 of them carrying a large barrel between them. The third directed them to place it carefully in front of the dwarf leader, and then, with great ceremony, drove a tap into the keg with a wooden hammer. He poured a small amount of the frothing contents into his hands, sniffed it, and then dipped his tongue into the liquid. He thrust the hand towards Malekith with his thumb pointed up and smiled. Malekith smiled in return, but felt it best not to return the gesture, lest it was some sign of disrespect. The chief dwarf then stood up and strutted over to the barrel and filled his golden tankard with the brew. Hesitantly, Yesir followed suit, sniffing cautiously at his mug's contents. Malekith looked inquiringly at his lieutenant, who replied with an amused shrug. The other 2 elves then filled up their tankards and returned to their seats. Raising his tankard in a way that even the elves recognised as a toast, the dwarf brought his cup up to his lips and downed the contents with 3 gargantuan gulps. With a satisfying smack of the lips, he slammed the tankard down onto the bench beside him. Bubbles of foam were stuck upon his beard, and he wiped them away with the back of his hand and winked at Malekith. Hesitantly, Malekith allowed a dribble of the liquid to pass his lips. It was quite thick and almost stung his tongue with its bitterness. He could not suppress a quick choking cough, which elicited more gentle laughter from the dwarves. His pride wounded by their good-natured yet mocking humour, Malekith snarled and took a more serious draught of the potion. He fought against the urge to retch as he swallowed, and then gulped down more and more. He felt his eyes watering at its acrid taste, which was as different from the delicate wines of Ulthuan as winter is from summer. Gulping down the last mouthful, Malekith fought back the bile rising in his throat and playfully tossed the tankard over his shoulder and raised an inquisitive eyebrow. At this, the dwarves erupted into more laughter, but this time it was clearly directed at their leader, who gave a snort and then a nod of appreciation. Malekith glanced across to Ysir and Elandrian, who appeared to be both finishing their drinks. However, out of the corner of his eye, Malekith spied patches of dampness upon the earth, close to his companions, and suspected that they had used the distraction offered by his performance to pour away most of their drink. They spent the rest of the night communicating in crude fashion, naming objects in each of their tongues and such like. Malekith dispatched Ysir to take word to the others that all was well, keeping Elandrian close by. His lieutenant displayed an unseen gift for language, and had already picked up a smattering of Dwarfish. Over the next 4 days, Malekith and Elandrian spent much time with the dwarves, and invited Kurgrik to the Nagarothi camp. Through Elandrian it transpired that Kurgrik was a thane, one of the nobles of a mighty city in the mountains called Karaz Akarak. As alien as the elves had been in the dwarf encampment, so too were the dwarves in the elves. As host, Malekith offered the dwarves golden goblets of the finest Kafik wine he had, which the dwarfs quaffed with enthusiasm, as the elves sampled their cups with more refinement. The dwarfs were inquisitive, but not offensively so, always polite to inquire, through Elandrian, whether they could inspect the elves' tents, weapons, water caskets, and all other manner of items. They ran their rough hands over elegantly etched armour with surprising delicacy, and gave approving grunts when they looked at the keen spearheads and arrows of the elves. As night fell on the 4th day, Elandrian returned from the dwarf camp as Malekith sat in his tent, watching one of his many servants polish his armour. Elandrian brought Ysir with him, and the 2 lieutenants bowed as they entered the pavilion. Catching the look in their eyes, Malekith dismissed the retainer and waved a hand for them to sit upon the plush rugs that served as a floor. "You have news?" Malekith said idly, swirling wine around in a silver goblet. "Indeed, Highness," said Elandrian. "Kurgrik intends to leave on the morrow." Malekith digested this without comment, and Elandrian continued. "Kurgrik has extended to you an invitation to accompany him back to the dwarf realms." "Has he?" said Malekith. "How interesting. What do you make of his motives?" "I am no expert, Highness, but he seems sincere enough to me," said Elandrian. "He says that you may take an escort of 50 warriors." "Careful, Highness," said Ysir. "Though 50 Nagarothi would be guard enough against Kurgrik's small force, only the gods know what lies ahead. Even if we take the dwarves at their word, which I don't, you would be relying upon them to provide you with adequate protection against any number of unknown perils. There are orcs and beasts aplenty still. I would say, if they should attack, who is to say that the dwarfs will stand their ground and not abandon you?" "I do not think that the dwarfs would have ventured this far from the mountain homes if they were cowardly," said Elandrian. "There was no fear in them that I could see when they came to our camp, though they were at our mercy." "Bravery and duty are not the same thing," said Ysir, standing up and starting to pace. "It is one thing for them to fight for themselves, but would they do so for our prince?" He strode to the tent door and threw open the flap. "Every elf of Nagaroth out there would lay down his life for our lord," Ysir said. "Yet not one of them would risk his blood for Kurgrik unless the prince commanded it. I would expect no more from the dwarves, and quite a lot less if I'm to be honest. What if Kurgrik falls? Would his warriors fight on for Malekith?" "We can demand oaths that they will," answered Elandrian. "They value honour highly, and I would say that their word is almost as good as any elf's promise." "No matter," snapped Malekith. "If I am to go, I shall look to myself as ever, and not rely upon the dwarfs for my safety. A more fundamental question is whether it is worth my time to go at all. It would be most informative, I am sure, Highness, said Elandrian. We can learn much, not only of the dwarves, but of the world further to the east. We can judge the size of their armies and the quality of their fighters, added Ysir. It will be best that we know our foes. If foes they are, said Elandrian, as a gesture of faith and friendship, such embassy could bring us valuable allies. Allies, said Malekith. Naggareth prospers upon her own strength and needs not the charity of others. I have not made my point clearly, your highness, said Elandrian with an apologetic bow. Ever will the other princes of Ulthuan be jealous of our power, and in Elfin Arvan there is none that can equal the power of Prince Malekith. Though all are of one heart and spirit for the moment, the loyalties of the other realms may well change. Belshazzar cares not for the colonies at the present, for they are distant from Toran Rock. Yet should his gaze turn upon these shores, how many of your fellow princes would stand by your side if the Phoenix Throne desired control over these lands? And how would the dwarves guard against that? Said Malekith, setting down his goblet and turning an intense stare upon his captain. They are entirely free of influence from Ulthuan, Elandrian explained. With the dwarfs as your friends, you will be the pawnbroker in Elfin Arvan, and it is Belshazzar who will have to tread carefully in his dealings with you. My mind is not made for politics, said Ysir, striding back from the door to stand before his master. I leave that to you. However, what I have seen of the dwarf's war gear, it is durable and well made. At the moment, we still rely much upon imports from Naggareth to keep your warriors armed and armoured. If you could secure a more local source for such things, it improves our security. Ever the practical one, Ysir, said Elandrian. Prince, envisage a treaty between Ulthuan and the dwarves, for the betterment of both. Who is more fitting to herald such an age than Malekith of Naggareth? Your flattery is crude and obvious, Elandrian, but Ysir's practicalities convince me, announced Malekith, standing up. Elandrian, you shall convey my wishes to the dwarf Thane that I shall accompany him back to his lands. Press upon him the honour he is being granted, and extract whatever assurances your worries require and prudence expects. Of course, Highness, replied Elandrian with a bow. Ysir, I have another task for you, said Malekith. I am ready to serve, Highness, said Ysir. I shall write 2 letters this night and entrust them to you before I depart, said the prince. One is destined for Toran Rock and the hand of Belshazzar. I would not have the Phoenix King accuse me of keeping this news from him. And the other, Highness, said Ysir. The other shall be for my mother, said Malekith, with a wry smile. Make sure that you deliver it first. If Morathai were to learn second hand of what happens here, none of our lives would be worth living. The following day, Malekith, Elandrian, and 50 Naggarothi warriors accompanied Kurgrik as the dwarf Thane headed back to the mountains. For the most part, the elves marched in silence alongside their newfound allies, who were equally taciturn. Malekith strolled alongside Kurgrik with Elandrian to translate, and even though excuse me, and though whether he appeared at ease, the prince's eyes and ears were always alert. Though the dwarves had been confident enough in their camp, as they set out eastwards, their party became more wary. There were roughly 200 dwarves in the group, along with many wagons pulled by sturdy ponies laden with felled trees. A vanguard of some 50 dwarfs preceded the march, half a mile ahead of the main group, who walked slowly but surely alongside the wagons. All of the dwarfs were armed, and their hands were never far from the hafts of their axes and swords as they marched along the road. Ever the dwarfs were watchful, sending out scouts into the woods to warn of ambush. The pace was not quick. Malekith and the other elves could have moved far more swiftly had they chosen to do so. However, the dwarfs marched relentlessly, and such was the efficiency with which they set and broke camp that they covered many miles each day, never wavering or tiring. At night, the dwarves would quickly dig defensive ditches lined with sharpened logs from the carts, and watchful guards patrolled ceaselessly. Kurgrik continued to entertain his guests with beer and such stories as Elandrian could translate. 4 days into the trek, the forests finally relinquished their weakening grip on the lands and were replaced by rising meadows and windswept hills. The mountains towered ahead, their snowy peaks lost amongst permanent clouds. Even the highest peaks of the Annuli Mountains on Ulthuan were diminutive by the standards of these ancient mounts, which stretched across the horizon, north and south, seemingly going on forever. The hills were covered with long grass and bracken, and littered with tumbled boulders swept down from the mountains in ages past. Paths and animals' trails led off from the road, but it continued straight on, through briar and across moor, heading eastwards. As the group came nearer to the mountains, the first of several dwarf-built keeps came into sight. It was a low, broad structure, only 2 stories high, utterly unlike the majestic towers and spires of Ulthuan, and quite ugly to Malekith's eye. The fort was crowded with battlements and protected by square towers at each corner. It stood on a hill overlooking the road, with large catapults and bolt-hurling engines upon its walls. Dwarves armed with axes and hammers marched out to meet Kurgrik and his curious guests, and as a storm swept down from the mountains, lashing the hills with driving rains and winds, the travellers were quickly ushered inside by the fort's commander. Within the thick walls, the keep was sparsely furnished, and Malekith found the bare stone depressing. He wondered why the dwarfs did not hide the grey rock with tapestries and paintings. His mood was somewhat mollified as they were brought into a long, low hall with a roaring fire pit at the centre. No matter how dreary the dwarf's aesthetic crudeness, it was preferable to the tempest that was now raging outside. Kurgrik introduced their host as Grobrimdor, a venerable dwarf of more than 400 winters, whose white beard was half as long again as he was tall. He wore his thick mail coat at all times, and an axe was hung at his belt, even as he introduced the more prominent members of the garrison. It was clear to Malekith that despite the storm, the dwarfs were still wary of attack. Grobrimdor and Kurgrik furnished the elves with rough blankets and bowls of thick soup, and then asked politely if Malekith would talk more with them concerning the elves and Ulthuan. With Elandrian to roughly translate, Malekith seated himself upon a low stool by the fire. Far to the west, beyond the vast forest, lies the great ocean, the prince began. Travel across the high waves for many days, and one comes upon the shores of Ulthuan. Our isle is fertile and green, an emerald set upon a sea of sapphire. White towers rise above the tall trees, and verdant pastures against the backdrop of the glittering peaks of the Annuli Mountains. And you live in these mountains, yes? Said Kurgrik. Only to hunt, replied Malekith, except in Trace and Calador, where all is mountains and hills, and there are no meadows or grass-filled plains on which to live. Kurgrik took this answer with a disappointed grunt, but then his eyes lit up with a new vigour. These mountains contain gems and gold? Asked the Thane. Gold and silver, diamonds and crystals, all kinds, said Malekith. And perhaps your king would trade these with our people, said Kurgrik, getting quite animated. It is not for the Phoenix King alone to decide such matters, Malekith said. We have many princes, and each of the realms of Ulthuan is ruled over by such an elf. It is for each to decide the fate and future of his lands and people. I rule Nagarith, the greatest of the kingdoms of Ulthuan, and reign over the colonies to the west of here. That is good, said Grobrimdor, gesturing for his retainers to bring mugs of ale. It is so with us. Our kings rule our cities, and the High King commands from Karazakarak. Your king must be a great leader to rule over so many princes. Malekith stifled his reply before it was spoken, and suppressed the urge to glance towards Elandrian. Instead, he took a sip of ale, buying time to compose his response. Belshazzar the Phoenix King is a clever statesman and diplomatic with his words, said Malekith. My father, the first Phoenix King, was a great leader. He was our greatest warrior and our salvation from darkness. If your father was king, why does his son not succeed him? Asked Kurgrik, his knotty brows furrowed with suspicion. Malekith was again forced to think his response through carefully, lest he betray some weakness or flaw that would offend the dwarfs. I will rule Ulthuan when she is ready for me, said the prince. She needed time to heal from a great war fought against the demons of the north, and so the princes chose not to follow the line of my father, but to elevate one of their own to the Phoenix throne. In the interests of harmony and peace, I do not challenge their decision. Both Grombrindor and Kurgrik nodded and grunted approvingly, and Malekith relaxed a little. His thoughts were still turbulent, though. The dwarf's questions stirred old ambitions, feelings that Malekith had travelled to Elfin Arvan to leave behind. Elandrian, sensing his prince's unease, filled the silence. You spoke of trade, said the captain. Our cities grow ever more swiftly with each year. What can your people offer us in exchange for our riches? The conversation turned once again to a subject dear to the dwarfs' hearts, and all talk of rulership and succession was forgotten. Malekith spoke little for the rest of the evening, and allowed his mind to drift, knowing that Elandrian could later convey any news of import. Long before midnight, the dwarf showed the elves to their rough quarters. Malekith slept in a large dormitory with his warriors, all of them upon the floor, for the dwarf cots were far too short for the tall elves. Having slept poorly, Malekith woke early in the morning. Many of the dwarfs were already up and about, or had perhaps passed the night without sleeping. The prince swiftly donned a simple robe and cloak, and left the dormitory. The dwarfs said gruff welcomes as he passed into the main hall, but did not attempt to stop him. Guided only by whim, Malekith climbed a short staircase and exited out of a squat tower onto the battlements. The sun was but a dull glow behind the mountains, which reared up into the dark blue skies in an unending line of jagged peaks. A thick mist coiled about the keep, and the breath of the dwarf sentries formed clouds in the air. Droplets of water shone on their beards and iron armour. All was peaceful, save for the sound of metallic boots on stone and the jingle of the dwarf's mail armour. Malekith stood, looking east towards the mountains for some time, until elven voices from below warned him that his companions were stirring. He was about to descend back to the hall when Elandrian hurried from the tower. The lieutenant visibly relaxed upon seeing his prince, and his expression turned to sheepish guilt when Malekith raised an inquiring brow. I awoke to find you missing, said Elandrian, striding quickly along the stone wall. I thought that perhaps some ill had befallen you. You thought that perhaps I had been taken hostage, said Malekith, that through some sorcery they had spirited me away without a fight. I don't know what I thought really, Highness, said Elandrian. I was suddenly fearful and reminded of Yesir's warnings. Malekith turned back to the majestic view. The fog had all but gone, and the mountains were revealed in all of their majesty. The prince took a deep breath, and then let it out with feeling. I would not swap such sights for the quiet pedantry of the Phoenix throne, he declared. Who needs to be Phoenix King when glory and conquest await? Let Belshazzar wither away in courts and audiences, while the wider world awaits me. Elandrian looked unconvinced. What is it? said Malekith. It's Belshazzar who chooses to stay in Ulthuan. Excuse me. To stay in Ulthuan and turn his reign into one of domesticity and politics, said Elandrian, turning his gaze towards the mountains. Were you to be Phoenix King, I have no doubt that you would do so at the head of our armies, not from the comfort of Anlec. In time, the princes will see that their king leads from behind them, not from the front. They will see the true worth of Naggareth and her prince. Perhaps, said Malekith, perhaps one day they will. The two stood in silence for a short while, gazing at the mountains, each content in his own thoughts concerning what they and their dwarven rulers might herald for the Naggarothi. The sun now rose above the lowest peaks, and golden light spilled down upon the hills. A gruff cough attracted Malekith's attention, and he turned to see a dwarf standing in the tower doorway. "We should rejoin our host, Highness," said Elandrian. "Kurgrick will wish to leave soon." "Go ahead and prepare for our departure," said Malekith, looking back at the mountains, but his thoughts were far to the west, upon Ulthuan. "I'll be with you shortly." Over the following days, the dwarves and elves stopped at several more of the way forts. Each was as drab as the first, and Malekith's expectation of the dwarf cities sank with every new sighting of the small functional buildings. The dwarfs took the time to spend a night in each of these way fortresses, to gather news from the garrisons and show off their intriguing guests. The beer they had been presented with at the first meeting was much in evidence, and out of courtesy, Malekith deigned to sample the different brews offered to him by each of the keep commanders. Though far from enamoured of the vulgar ale, Malekith soon learned the art of swallowing his allotted draught swiftly, so as to leave as little taste as possible in his mouth. He thought that perhaps this was why the dwarfs also drank so quickly, that they did not really like the taste of their own brews. However, the regularity with which the dwarfs returned to their barrels in an evening suggested otherwise. When they came into the mountains proper, the dwarfs warned the elves to remain on their guard. Though the forests were the realm of the chaotic denizens and bloodthirsty beasts, the mountains were also home to many orcs and goblins and other creatures, such as trolls, giants, and monstrous birds that frequently came south in search of food. "Many demons and monsters once besieged our hold," said Kurgrick, via Elandrian's improving skills as a translator. The foothills were now rising steeply towards the mountains. The column was winding its way along a rough track, Kurgrick riding on his wagon, Malekith and Elandrian walking beside it. The sun hid, and endless night darkened the mountains, the Thane continued. The valley echoed to the howls and roars of the creatures of the north. They beat upon our gates and hurled themselves at our walls. Many dwarfs died, defending their homes against the horrors. "We too suffered under the assault of chaos," Malekith said. "Then Anarion, my father, led the war against the demons and brought us through the dark times." "Grimnir was the greatest of our warriors," said Kurgrick, with a wistful smile. "Grungi, master of the runes, and wise beyond mortals, forged 2 great axes for Grimnir. With these he slaughtered an army of the beasts. Valia wove a cloak for her kin, and with her protective gift, Grimnir fought against the largest and most deadly foes. Yet for all his fierce skill, Grimnir could not defeat every demon, for they came forth in an unending tide." "As it was on Ulthuan," said Malekith. "Without end came the legions of chaos. We fought without hope until Anarion made the final sacrifice. He spilt his blood upon the altar of Cain in return for victory. Grimnir travelled far into the north with one of his axes, and fought to the great gate of the Chaos Gods," Kurgrick said, frowning slightly at the prince's interruption. "He was never seen again, and his axe was lost. He battled into the gates themselves, and even now wages war upon the demons in their own realm, holding back their unending companies." "Calador's vortex closed the gates," said Malekith. "It was the magic of the elves that stemmed the demonic tide." Elandrian looked hesitant and did not translate his master's words. "Why the silence?" demanded Malekith. "Perhaps it's better that the dwarfs do not know that we trapped their greatest hero within the realm of chaos," Elandrian said with a warning look. "They may not take kindly to such knowledge." "We cannot let them peddle this fallacy," Malekith insisted. "It is the strength of the elves, not the dwarves, that holds back the forces of the dark gods." Who is to say that the dwarven ancestors did not unwittingly aid Calidor's conjuration, said Elandrian. That they suffered under the darkness of chaos surely gives us more in common with them. Allow them to celebrate their own victories, for they do not tarnish your father. Malekith considered this, not entirely convinced that he could allow the dwarfs to undermine the achievements of Anarion. A glance at Kurgrik showed the dwarf watching the elves exchange with friendly bemusement. The prince relented upon seeing the dwarf's ugly, honest face. Say that both elves and dwarves have earned their right to live free upon this world, said Malekith. Tell him that it is my hope that we no longer fight alone, but as allies. Elandrian's expression was one of shock. What? Demanded Malekith. What's wrong with that? Nothing, Highness, said Elandrian. Quite the opposite. In fact, that is the most diplomatic thing I have heard pass from your lips in 100 years. The glint of laughter in Elandrian's eyes quelled the angry retort welling up in Malekith's throat, and the prince merely coughed as if clearing his throat. Just keep the dwarf happy, he finally managed to say, suppressing a smug smile. Their journey took them on for 13 days before they reached the dwarf city, or hold as it was known to the dwarfs. Karak Kadrin they named it, one of the most northern cities in the mountains. The location of the city was unmistakable, and as different from the road stations as could be imagined. High ramparts and towers dotted the sides of the pass, overlooking the approaches with sentries and war engines. Immense faces shaped into stylized likeness of dwarves were carved into the mountainsides, the ancestor gods, the elves were told. From dark rock were the gatehouses carved, seen for the first time as the road turned to the north edge of the pass and begun to wide back and forth up the hillside. They were as two mighty keeps, their foundations made from the mountain itself, thousands of heavy stones painstakingly cut and fitted to form fortifications that rivaled the great sea gates of Lothern. Golden standards glittered in the mountain sun, and banners stitched with angular runes and more of the curious dwarf designs hung from the ramparts. Between the two immense flanking towers, the gates were closed. Almost as high as the gatehouse, arching far above the pass below, the gate was covered with plates of gold, embossed with ancestor faces and symbols of smithying such as anvils, hammers and forges. Warriors clad in chainmail and heavy plates of armour guarded the portal, their expressions hidden behind full-faced helms wrought in the likeness of fierce dwarf visages. As the party came within sight of the gate towers, horns began to sound out, filling the valley with long, sonorous peals that rose and fell in harmony with the rebounding echoes. At this signal, a much smaller door in the gate opened, though still thrice the height of an elf, and broad enough for them to enter 10 abreast. Malekith had been impressed by the outer workings of the hold, but when he passed through the gate, he stopped dead in his tracks and looked around in awe. The entrance hall was dug from the bare rock of the mountain, and far from the dreary stone of the waykeeps, it had been fashioned and polished so that it glittered in the light of hundreds of lanterns, every fault and strata a glorious decoration in its own right. Long and no wider than the main gate, the hallway delved into the mountain, its high ceiling held by great arches carved from the living rock and sheathed in silver. The columns along the walls were cut in the same stylized fashion as the bastions upon the mountainside, pillars of angular dwarf faces rising into the vaults above. The lanterns that illuminated the impressive scene hung from thick chains suspended from the high vaults, each lamp larger than a dwarf and glowing with magical light. In the glow of these, the carvings between the arches could clearly be seen, depicting dwarf warriors at war, workers labouring in mines, smiths pounding at the forges, and other vignettes of dwarfish endeavour. The floor was covered with regular flags, but each had been painstakingly etched with runes and lines of knotted patterns, the carved channels filled with coloured glass, so that the ground was a riot of blues, reds, and greens. More dwarf guards lined the walls, arrayed in a line down each side, garbed in armour chased with gold, their double-headed axes inlaid with precious gems. Messengers had been sent ahead, and the party was greeted with much ceremony. As they passed through the gigantic gateway, the first pair of guards raised their weapons in salute, and so on down the line as the procession made its way along the long hallway. At the far end stood a delegation of dwarves in brightly patterned jerkins, wearing elaborate helms adorned with horns or wings of gold, and each wore many rings and braces, necklaces, brooches, so that they sparkled in the lantern light as they moved. Behind each stood a banner-bearer, carrying a standard displaying the arms of the dwarf lords, bedecked with golden and silver badges, and woven from fine metallic threads of every conceivable hue and shine. As with the other decorations, these were of axes and hammers, anvils and lightning bolts, displayed with such glimmering perfection that Malekith could imagine the royal standard of Naggaroth being created in such a way. Behind the welcoming party stood a door almost as large as the one by which the elves had entered. Cut from a solid piece of wood from some gigantic mountain oak, it was studded with bronze bolts, the head of each identically crafted as a pair of crossed hammers. The dignitaries bowed low, sweeping their beards to one side with an arm so that they did not brush upon the ground. Malekith nodded his head in return, and the other elves also bowed in welcome. One of the nobles bore a large ornamental mace, and he turned and struck the door 3 mighty blows. The booms resounding around the hall, a slot opened in the door at about the height of a dwarf's face, and words were exchanged. There seemed to be some kind of argument, but Malekith suspected that this was some form of purposeful exchange whose significance eluded him. Then the door opened, swinging effortlessly on hinges buried deep within the walls to reveal the chambers beyond. The hold was a veritable maze of corridors, halls and galleries, and though he tried to keep track of his path, Malekith soon found that he was lost amongst the unending passages and stairwells. They seemed to be progressing up into the mountain, although by a circulatory route that rose and dipped. The interior of the hold was not quite so grand as the entrance chamber, but still well built and decorated with gems and precious metals. Here and there the route took them past glowing foundries where the heat of furnaces blasted from open archways and the ringing of hammers echoed all around the visitors. There seemed to be little relent from the labour, though occasionally an artisan or forge worker would look up from his endeavours. The impression Malekith was left with was one of constant industry, as dwarfs wearing dirty smocks and leather aprons busied themselves about the tunnels and rooms. Eventually they were brought into the audience chamber of King Gazarund. It was a wide, low hall, with shields and banners hung upon the walls. The 2 long fire pits blazed to each side, the smoke from which disappeared up a cunning series of chimneys and channels to the mountainside far above. A walkway raised slightly above the rest of the chamber ran from the doorway to the throne dais, ascending up nearly 20 feet in a series of stepped rises. Bathed in the flickering red flames, the gold inlaid tiles of the floor glimmered with ruddy light. Kurgrik motioned for the elves to halt, and with the other thanes and notable members of the king's council, they made his way forward. King Gazarun sat upon a throne of black granite, decorated with more gold tracery. His expression was austere rather than welcoming, and in the firelight his dark eyes shone from under beetling brows. He was bare-armed save for 2 intricately wound torques upon each bicep, and he was robed in a simple tabard of blue and white. His beard was thick and black, straggled with stray wisps of grey, and was so long that despite being coiled through loops upon his belt and woven into winding plaits, it still hung almost to the ground. His face was craggy and creased, his skin pocked with the scars of years. Most distinctively, He wore a golden patch over his right eye, and to Malekith's inner horror, it appeared that this covering was riveted into the king's flesh. The king's crown was set on a table beside the throne, so large and baroque that even this sturdy dwarf would not have been able to bear its weight upon his head. Wings as large as an eagle splayed from the war helm, and its cheek guards were studded with dozens of diamonds. In its place, the king wore a simple steel cap, banded with brazen knotwork, a few wisps of unkempt hair, especially from under its fur-lined brim. The dwarf nobles made petitions to the king, or so it seemed to Malekith, from his experience of similar ceremonies at the court of Belshazzar. The king nodded once, and the elves were waved forward. With great deliberation, the true ritual of welcoming began, carried out with solemn decorum by the king of Carrick Cadrin and his thanes. Malekith and the king exchanged gifts. For the prince, a dwarf-wrought brooch of gold. For the king, a fine elven bracelet made of silver and decorated with sapphires. Malekith was presented to the nobles of the hold via a list of unintelligible names that he soon forgot, and then was ushered into the chambers that had been set aside for them to stay. The bedrooms were accommodating, but far from plush. The furniture was for dwarfs, and so the chairs and beds were distressingly low. Malekith found it easier to kneel before the clay basin upon the wall to wash his face, rather than clean himself at a constant stoop. There was no fire in the room, but a steady breeze of warm air came from a grated vent upon the wall. Malekith surmised this was somehow redirected from the forges below, by some ingenious means. The fabrics upon the bed and chairs were stiff and unyielding, as was the padding in the mattress. Though Malekith would have preferred something a little more kind to lie upon, it was by no means a necessity for him, having spent many of his long years on campaign in the wilderness. After resting for a short while, Malekith then made it known to the dwarf who stood guard outside his door that he was ready to eat, by the simple expedient of mimicking food to his mouth and rubbing his stomach. The dwarf nodded in understanding and garbled something in return, and then stood back in his place. Having called for Elandrian, Malekith again asked for something to eat, only to be told that there was a banquet to be held in their honour that night. It was a fulsome affair, with much quaffing of ale and long speeches that Malekith did not understand. The feasting hall was bedecked with more banners and great brass seals displaying the emblems of various clans and guilds of the hold. 3 tables were arranged down its length, each seating 100 feasters, and Malekith and his company sat at another table that ran across the head of the hall, along with the king and his most trusted companions. The food was for the most part palatable, consisting mostly of roast meats and boiled vegetables. Thick gravy and heavy dumplings were also served in abundance, along with pitchers of ale of all varieties and strengths. Malekith had become accustomed to delicately flavoured and fragranced meals, using such herbs and spices as grew on Ulthuan and in the islands on the other side of the world. The menu sat heavily on the prince's stomach, and he could see how the dwarfs were so sturdy of build and wide of girth. Still, the cooking was done with competence, if not finesse, though Malekith despaired of his host's table manners at times. Each course was served upon gigantic platters, and once the king had helped himself to whatever he desired, it seemed to become a free-for-all, where everybody else was concerned. Ales were slopped over the bare wooden boards of the tables, and Malekith kept a suspicious eye on a puddle of gravy that spread dangerously close to him as the evening progressed. Kurgrik, sitting on Malekith's left, had taken it upon himself to assist the prince with his dining, assuring himself that his guest was plentifully fed by heaping ladle upon ladle of stew into his bowl, and small mountains of potatoes, roast duck, barley cakes, and other simple fare upon his plate. Something else that took Malekith aback occurred shortly after the 4th course. There was a pause while the tables were cleared of plates and debris, and all of the dwarfs produced small pouches filled with dried ground leaves. The contents of these small bags they stuffed into pipes of all shapes and sizes, which they then lit and puffed on contentedly for quite some time. The haze of pipe smoke quickly filled the hall and hung in a thick fog above the table, causing many of the elves to cough violently, including Malekith. Misreading their discomfort as subtle prompts, Kurgrik proffered his tobacco to Malekith. The elven prince declined with a smile and a firm shake of the head, and Kurgrik shrugged and placed his leaf pouch back into the recesses of his robe, whence it had come, seeming not to take any offence. Several more platters of steamed potatoes, venison steaks, and immense sausages went by, and then a hush descended upon the hall. There followed several more speeches, which Elandrian attempted to translate as best he could. Most of them spoke about family honour, great tragedies, and valour in battle, and after a while Malekith stopped listening to his lieutenant and allowed his mind to drift. It was then he felt a sharp dig in his ribs, and looked around to see Elandrian looking at him pointedly. Casting his gaze around the smoky hall, the prince saw that all eyes were turned upon him. "It's your turn to make a toast, I believe," whispered Elandrian, with a mischievous smile. "Shall I translate?" "I would think it better not to," said Malekith. "I know that you have learnt well their strange tongue, but I would not have you accidentally call the king a bloated warthog on my behalf. I shall sound so suitably imperious and charismatic, the exact meaning of my words will not be necessary to convey their spirit." The Prince of Naggareth stood up, while Kurgrik leaned over and refilled his tankard with a beer that was so thick and black it could have been mistaken for pitch. "Your good health," said Malekith, raising the cup to the hall. The dwarfs sat in respectful expectation, hands hovering close to their tankards. They had no idea what the prince had just said. "What's the matter with them?" Malekith hissed out of the side of his mouth, whilst trying to maintain a general smile. "I think they will want something a little, longer," said Elandrian. "You'll have to go on for a bit, I believe, to make them think that they've been given a proper oratory." "Very well," said Malekith, turning his attention towards the king of the hold. "Your halls here are mighty and full of great wonders. I have marvelled at the skills of your people, and I know in my heart that an alliance with you shall bring much benefit to my people." A glance towards Elandrian received an encouraging nod, and Malekith continued, seeing the polite but clueless expressions on the sea of faces before him. The prince decided to indulge himself a little. "You are very fine people, if a little unwashed and short." The elves laughed quietly at this, and taking their cue, the dwarfs joined in, chortling uncertainly. "It has been mostly my pleasure to meet you all, though I have not a clue what your names are, and all of you look pretty much the same to me." Another sideways glance at Elandrian was received with a pout of disapproval, but Malekith ignored his aide and carried on with his joke. "That your mouths produce as much smoke as your chimneys is surprising, and if I do not choke to death before the evening is out, I shall thank the gods for protecting me. I understand that we have only just met, but I hope that in time you will understand the great privilege I have granted you all by allowing you into my presence. There are people of my own homeland who have never been granted an audience with me, and yet here I am, sinking cupfuls of your foul broth and treating you like equals. I am assured that you are an honourable people, and you best well be." At this point Malekith stood up and raised his foot upon the table to lean forwards, a feat not difficult for the slender elf, for the table barely came above his knees. "Know this," the prince proclaimed, his voice ringing clearly across the hall, focusing the attention of even the most drunkard audience member. "It will go well for you that we should become friends. The Naggarothi do not treat idly with others, even elves of other realms. Should you wrong us, our vengeance will be sure, swift, and deadly. We will burn these halls, and we will pile your corpses upon pyres so high that they will rival these mountains. We shall be content to let you dwell in these rocky peaks, and we shall take the lowlands and the forests. Should you oppose us, We will have no option but to drive you before us, as we have the orcs and the beasts and the goblins. I look forward to meeting your High King, for he shall hopefully be of an almost equal standing to myself, and of intelligence enough to treat with me. But I warn you, if I am not impressed with him, I may decide simply to slay all of you. In fact, the next one of you that mispronounces my name might just get my blade through his gizzard. While we may deign to learn your crude language, please do not mangle the heritage of my forefathers and the legacy to my descendants with your ugly lips and thick tongues. Raising his goblet once again, Malekith grinned broadly. Long may Naggareth prevail over you all, he declared. Before the prince could say any more, Alandrian shot to his feet and gave a shout of celebration, his mug upraised. The other elves, some of them clearly shocked, the rest wearing looks of approval, did likewise. The dwarfs then slowly followed their lead until there was a great rousing cheer that filled the hall with a cacophony of shouting and the slamming of cups upon tables. "Thank you," said Malekith, holding up a hand for silence. The dwarfs appeared not to understand the gesture, for they continued their banging and clapping. With Alandrian's hand on his arm, pulling him down before he could speak further, Malekith sat, a contented smile upon his face. This seemed to conclude the round of speeches, and servants came forth bearing great bowls of steaming pudding made from boiled grain and honey, with chunks of stodgy cake to dip into the sweet broth. This was followed by platters of hard cheeses that smelt of diseased goats, as far as Malekith could tell, which were served with small biscuits with the texture and taste of thin slices of dried wood. Under the stone roof of the hall, Malekith lost all sense of passing time, and knew not whether it was midnight or if dawn was fast approaching. When the elves were finally allowed to retire to their dormitories, many of the dwarfs still caroused, though a significant proportion of their number had simply slipped into inebriated stupors at the tables. For the highest-ranking attendees, the servants brought small pillows which were carefully placed under the snoring faces of the inebriated lords. The lesser peons were allowed to doze away, their faces in spillages and crumbs. All Malekith knew was that the banquet had been more tiring than the march, but he went to bed invigorated nonetheless, for his overly full stomach both appalled and yet mesmerized by the strange culture of these people. On the one hand, they were loud, careless, and ignorant of any form of etiquette, yet he had seen much evidence that they were also studious, observant, dedicated, and loyal. Their attention to detail in matters of craftsmanship equalled that of the elves, and in weapon-making and the construction of mechanical devices, their knowledge outstripped that of Ulthuan. That they knew of magic was clear from many of the things Malekith had seen in the hold, yet he had not seen any dwarf openly wielding sorcery, and when Alandrian had inquired on the prince's behalf, he had been met with polite but stern denials that the dwarfs had wizards of any kind.